I used to believe that family meant safety, that no matter how bad life became, someone would always notice when you were falling apart. But I learned that sometimes, the people closest to you can become experts at pretending not to see your pain. My name is Elena, and for as long as I can remember, I was the quiet one. The listener. The peacekeeper. The daughter who never argued, never demanded, never asked for more than what was given. My silence was once my strength, until it became the rope that slowly strangled me. It started the year my father lost his job. I still remember the morning he came home with his tie loosened, eyes dull and unfocused. He didn't even have to say it. The silence told the whole story. The company he'd given 20 years to had downsized. Just like that, our family's sense of security was shattered. My mother began pacing around the house, muttering about bills and shame. My brother, Daniel, laughed it off, telling us everything would be fine. But his laughter felt forced, the kind of laugh that hides fear. And me? I tried to help. I offered to take extra shifts at the bookstore where I work to cut down on my own expenses, but my suggestions were brushed aside like an annoying fly. "You're too young to worry about these things," my mother would say. But I wasn't too young. I was the only one who seemed to realize how deep the hole was getting. As weeks turned to months, the house grew colder, not just from unpaid electricity bills, but from resentment. Dinner became quiet, filled only with the clinking of utensils and the unspoken blame floating in the air. My mother started snapping over the smallest things, the way I folded laundry, the tone of my voice, the fact that I came home too late, even when I was just working overtime to pay for groceries. My father stopped looking anyone in the eye. He'd retreat to the garage and stay there until midnight, fixing things that didn't need fixing, pretending not to hear the arguments that erupted inside. And Daniel, well, he started disappearing at night, coming home smelling like alcohol and desperation. I knew something was wrong long before I had proof. He became defensive, secretive. He'd lock himself in his room, whispering on the phone. One evening, I walked into the kitchen to find my mother crying quietly into her hands. When I asked her what was wrong, she just said, "He's borrowed money. But it'll be fine. He'll pay it back." He didn't. Instead, he borrowed more. And worse, he borrowed it in my name. The first letter came on a Tuesday. I remember it clearly because it was raining, and I was already late for work. The envelope was from a loan agency I didn't recognize, addressed to me. My hands trembled as I opened it, scanning the numbers that didn't make sense. Thousands of dollars. A signature that wasn't mine. I felt sick. I ran to Daniel's room, my heart pounding. He was sitting on his bed, scrolling through his phone as if nothing had happened. "What is this?" I shouted, waving the paper. He looked up, annoyed. "Relax, it's temporary. I'll pay it off. I just needed some help. In my name?" I could barely get the words out. "You're overreacting," he said, brushing past me. "It's family money, family money." The phrase stabbed me like a knife. I ran to my parents, desperate for someone to understand. I showed them the papers, the forged signature, the due dates, and debt. My mother's expression didn't change. "Your brother's going through a hard time," she said softly, as if that excused everything. My father just sighed, rubbed his temples, and muttered, "Family helps family," but helping meant destroying myself. Days later, the collectors started calling. They demanded payment, threatened legal action, and every time the phone rang, I felt my chest tighten. At work, I tried to stay composed, but when my boss found out about the fraudulent loans under my name, I was suspended. "Until things are cleared," he said, not meeting my eyes. Word spread fast. People whispered. Friends avoided me. My name, my reputation, was being dragged through mud, and the people who were supposed to love me most didn't even care enough to help me clean it. One night I came home after a long walk. I could hear laughter coming from the living room, my family watching a movie, eating dinner, chatting like everything was fine. I stood in the hallway, invisible. My mother noticed me, asked casually, "You're home. Did you sort out that bank thing yet?" No apology. No concern. Just indifference. I wanted to scream, to make them understand what they'd done to me. but when I opened my mouth, nothing came out. That was the moment I realized something painful. You can't save comfortable people watching you drown. That night, I lay on my bed, staring at the ceiling. I thought about every time I had defended them, every time I had covered for my brother, every time I had silenced my pain to keep the peace. What did it get me? A pile of debt, a ruined name, and a family that only saw me when they needed something. I stopped eating dinner with them. I stopped answering calls. I withdrew the last bit of money from my savings, barely enough for a bus ticket. In my journal, I wrote, "Maybe if I disappear, they'll finally hear the silence they created." But the decision didn't come all at once. It came in fragments, like pieces of a mirror slowly falling apart. The night my brother borrowed my car without asking and crashed it. In the morning, my mother blamed me for not having insurance. The day I overheard my father telling a neighbor, "Elena's always been dramatic." Each moment chipped away at whatever love I still had left. On the final night before I left, I sat by the window listening to the rain. It sounded like the world was crying for me. My suitcase sat by the door, small and unassuming, filled only with the essentials. A few clothes, my ID, my journal, and the photograph of me as a child, smiling between my parents before everything fell apart. I stared at that photo for a long time. The girl in it still believed in happy endings. I didn't. At dawn, I stood in the kitchen looking around one last time. The sink was full of unwashed dishes. The counter was cluttered with unopened bills. My mother's slippers were by the door, my father's jacket on the chair. It all felt so painfully normal, as if the chaos had become part of the decor. I left a note on the table, not with explanations, not with accusations. Just 5 words: "Don't look for me anymore." As I stepped outside, the air felt heavy but freeing. The world was quiet, a kind of quiet that wasn't lonely but liberating. I walked to the bus stop, my shoes soaked in rain, my heart oddly calm. Behind me was the house that had stopped feeling like home a long time ago. Ahead of me was uncertainty, but also the faintest whisper of hope. When the bus pulled away, I looked out the window and watched the city fade. The streets I once knew blurred into gray shapes, and for the first time, I didn't feel the urge to turn back. I didn't cry. I didn't doubt. I simply let go. That morning, somewhere between the city I was leaving and the one waiting ahead, I made a promise to myself. I would never beg to be heard again. I would never explain my pain to people who used it as background noise. From now on, my silence would be my statement. And that's when I decided to disappear. Not out of weakness, but out of strength. Because sometimes the loudest revenge isn't shouting back. It's walking away so quietly that your absence becomes the only thing they can hear. When I left my family behind that morning, I didn't know whether I was running away from them or finally running toward myself. The bus ride out of the city felt endless, yet I remember every second of it. The way the dawn light crawled over the window, the soft hum of the tires on wet asphalt, and the feeling of my chest rising and falling, steady for the first time in years. I stared out the window as the familiar streets faded into distant shadows. For years I had begged them to see me, to hear me, to love me. And now, all I wanted was distance. I didn't cry. I didn't even feel angry anymore. I was hollow, like a house after the fire, still standing but empty inside. The bus stopped in a small coastal town called Brindle Bay, a place that barely appeared on any map. The air smelled like salt and old wood, the kind of scent that clings to everything and makes you feel both alive and forgotten. That was exactly what I needed, to be forgotten. I rented a tiny room above an old bookstore where the landlady, Mrs. Calloway, didn't ask questions. She just handed me the keys, gave me a polite nod, and told me, "Quiet tenants are my favorite kind." The room was small but clean, a single bed, a wobbly wooden table, and a window overlooking the ocean. I spent the first few nights just sitting by that window, listening to the waves crash against the rocks. Their rhythm was hypnotic, like the earth breathing in and out. I hadn't realized how much noise I had been living in until silence became my only companion. It wasn't the silence of neglect this time. It was the silence of peace. Within a week, I found work at a cafe near the pier. It was run by an older couple, Martin and Teresa, who treated everyone like family, something I wasn't used to anymore. The cafe was small but always busy with fishermen, tourists, and locals. My job was simple: take orders, clean tables, and serve coffee. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest. Every day I came home smelling like roasted beans and sea salt, and for the first time in years, that smell didn't remind me of shame or exhaustion. It reminded me of survival. I started journaling again, something I hadn't done since high school. At first, my entries were short. Worked double shift. Tired but okay. Then, slowly, they grew longer. I wrote about the people I met, the seagulls that stole croissants from the tables, and the sound of laughter that filled the cafe in the morning. I began sketching faces of strangers, capturing their fleeting expressions: joy, curiosity, contentment, emotions I was learning to feel again. Healing, I realized, doesn't come as a grand moment of clarity. It's quiet. It's the way you notice the sunlight hitting your hands while you pour coffee. It's sleeping through the night without waking from nightmares. It's forgiving yourself for believing that your pain was your fault. Still, the past had a way of creeping back, like the tide reclaiming the shore. Some nights I'd wake up gasping, certain I'd heard my brother's voice calling me a liar. Other times I'd dream of my mother's disappointed glare or my father's silence echoing in the dining room. I'd sit up, heart racing, and remind myself, they can't hurt you anymore. You're free. 3 months passed before I heard from the past again. It came not as a phone call or a letter, but as a notification on my old email, one I had almost forgotten existed. The subject line read, "Urgent. Account under investigation." My hands trembled as I opened it. It was from the bank, the same one that had called me a fraud months ago. The email explained that an attempt had been made to open a new loan under my old name. The system had automatically flagged it for review. I sat there frozen. My brother, he was still trying, still using my name, my identity, my life. But this time things were different. This time I wasn't the one drowning while they stood by. I had rebuilt myself piece by piece and I wasn't afraid anymore. The next morning, I went to the police station in Brindle Bay. The officer at the desk listened carefully as I explained everything, from the forged loans to the ignored pleas for help. He asked for my ID, nodded, and said, "You've done the right thing by coming forward. We'll contact the bank." His tone was calm, almost detached, but I felt something heavy lift off my chest. I had spoken my truth without trembling. For the first time, I wasn't a victim begging for help. I was a survivor reclaiming my story. Weeks later, a woman walked into the cafe. She wore a gray suit and carried a leather folder. Her eyes scanned the room until they landed on me. "Elena Moore?" she asked softly. My stomach dropped. "Yes," she smiled politely. "My name is Clara Jensen. I'm an investigator from the Financial Crimes Division. I believe you may have some information that can help us with a case involving your family." The word family stung like a blade dipped in salt. I nodded and led her to a quiet corner. She opened her folder, revealing documents: my old address, my brother's forged signature, bank transfers I didn't recognize. She asked me questions, and I answered each one carefully. I told her everything: the debt, the calls, the lies, the nights I cried alone while they pretended not to hear me. When I finished, Clara closed her folder slowly and looked at me with an expression that wasn't pity. It was understanding. "You know," she said quietly, "sometimes justice doesn't need revenge. It just needs truth." Her words echoed in my mind long after she left. Truth. That was something my family had always twisted, reshaped, and weaponized. But now it was on my side. A few days later, the story hit the local news. Family accused of fraudulent loan scheme. I didn't have to read the full article to know. It was them, my brother, my parents, the same people who told me to stop exaggerating. Their faces were plastered on headlines I never wanted to see. My brother had been arrested for multiple counts of identity fraud and falsified financial records. My parents were being investigated for complicity. My phone, the one I hadn't used in months, began to ring nonstop. Unknown numbers, messages from old acquaintances, and eventually, their numbers. My mother, my father, even Daniel. Each time, I watched the screen light up, then fade into darkness again. I didn't answer. I couldn't. There was nothing left to say. They had ignored me when I begged for help. Now they wanted forgiveness. But silence was the only thing I had left to give them. Still, I won't pretend it didn't hurt. There were nights I stared at the ocean, tears streaming down my face, wondering if I'd done the right thing. Even when justice is deserved, it doesn't always feel good. I miss the idea of family. The fantasy of love without betrayal, of trust without fear. But I knew that the people I left behind were never going to give me that. Over time, the noise faded. The calls stopped. The news moved on to another scandal. Life, as it always does, continued. The cafe became my sanctuary. The regular customers, fishermen, teachers, travelers, became my new kind of family. They didn't know my past, and they didn't need to. With them, I laughed again. I learned how to smile without guilt, to talk without fear of being interrupted or dismissed. One evening after closing the cafe, I stood on the pier, watching the sun sink into the sea. The sky burned in shades of orange and gold, and I felt the wind wrap around me like an embrace. For the first time, I realized that I wasn't waiting for karma anymore. I didn't need to. Karma had already spoken, not in the form of revenge, but through the quiet restoration of balance. They had built their lives on deceit, and the truth had simply undone them. I turned my face toward the horizon and whispered to myself, "You're free now," and for once I believed it. That night, I wrote a single line in my journal before bed. When I stopped begging for justice, truth found me instead. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything I had endured. I closed the notebook and placed it on the windowsill beside a small seashell I had picked up earlier that day, a reminder that even broken things can still be beautiful when the tide returns them home. I fell asleep, listening to the ocean, no longer haunted by the voices of the past. Somewhere in the distance, karma was still at work. But for me, for the woman who once disappeared, the silence finally meant peace. A full year passed before I saw my hometown again. By then, I wasn't the same person who had left it behind. The girl who once cried herself to sleep, begging to be seen, was gone. What remained was a woman who had learned how to build peace from the ashes of neglect. Life in Brindle Bay had changed me. It was slow, quiet, and deeply human. No one there cared about my past, only about who I was becoming. The cafe had become more than just a workplace. It was a rhythm, a small heartbeat of routine that reminded me every day that I was still alive. The ocean's voice, once melancholic, had turned into a lullaby. I had found a strange kind of happiness in solitude. But even peace has a way of circling back to where pain began. Sometimes healing isn't about forgetting. It's about being able to return without breaking. When the letter arrived, I was wiping down tables after the morning rush. The handwriting on the envelope was unfamiliar, shaky, and uneven. It wasn't from the bank, nor from any authority. It was from a name I hadn't seen in over a year, Margaret Moore, my mother. My stomach tightened as I traced the letters with my thumb. For a long time, I just stared at it, unsure whether to open it or throw it away. Eventually, curiosity, or maybe closure, won. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The words were short, but they carried the weight of 1,000 unsaid apologies. "Elena, I don't know if you'll ever read this. We lost everything. Your father's health is failing, and Daniel, he's not the same. I can't sleep at night thinking about what we did to you. If there's still a part of you that can forgive us, please come home." "Mom." My hands trembled as I folded the letter back. For a moment, I hated how easily those few sentences could awaken the old ache in my chest. Forgive them? After everything they'd done? After every ignored plea, every night I screamed in silence? But something inside me whispered that this wasn't about forgiveness. It was about finally closing the circle. That weekend, I packed a small bag and took the train back. The journey felt both foreign and familiar, as if I were moving through a memory that didn't quite belong to me anymore. When the train pulled into the station, I stepped out and felt the heavy air of the city settle on my skin. The skyline hadn't changed, but I had. I didn't go straight to their house. I couldn't. Instead, I walked to the park, the same one I used to sit in after every argument, wiping tears and pretending to read. The trees were taller now, their branches stretching like forgiving arms over the benches. The air smelled like rain, and the wind carried the faint hum of laughter from children playing nearby. I sat on a familiar bench and watched the sunlight spill through the leaves. I realized in that moment that I didn't hate them anymore. Hatred had once been a fire that kept me warm, but over time it had burned itself out. What replaced it wasn't love, it was acceptance. The kind that comes when you finally understand that some people simply don't know how to love you right. As the sun began to set, I walked toward the old grocery store near our street. It had been a quiet ritual in my past life. I used to go there every Sunday morning with my mother. I didn't expect to see them there, but fate, or perhaps karma, had a way of staging scenes at the perfect time. I saw them before they saw me. My parents stood near the entrance, their bodies hunched under the weight of years that hadn't been kind. My mother's once carefully dyed hair had turned gray, and my father leaned heavily on a cane. They looked small, fragile in a way I never imagined they could be. I stood there for a long moment, frozen between the urge to walk away and the need to let them see what I'd become. When my mother's eyes finally met mine, she gasped softly. I could see the recognition flood her face, disbelief, guilt, sorrow. She took a hesitant step forward, clutching her purse like it could shield her from the shame. "Elena," she whispered, her voice cracking like thin glass. I didn't move. The world around us seemed to fall silent. The cars, the chatter, the noise. Just her voice, trembling in the air between us. "I wanted to write to you sooner," she said, tears welling in her eyes. "I wanted to say sorry. We were so wrong. We should have listened, should have protected you." I took a step closer. My voice was calm, steady, like the ocean I had learned to love. "You taught me what silence feels like," I said quietly. "Now it's your turn to listen to it." Her mouth opened, but no words came out. My father stood behind her, looking at me with eyes that were both proud and broken. He didn't speak either. Maybe he couldn't. Maybe the weight of what they'd done had already silenced them. I didn't stay. I didn't want tears or explanations. I didn't want to be pulled back into their world of excuses. I turned and walked away, feeling the breeze tug gently at my hair. With every step, I felt lighter. Not victorious, just free. There's a difference between revenge and release. Revenge feeds the ego. Release feeds the soul. As I reached the corner, I looked back one last time. My mother was still standing there, clutching her chest, sobbing quietly into her hands. My father's head hung low. For a moment, I thought about going back, about wrapping my arms around them and saying, "It's okay." But it wasn't. And maybe it never would be. Some wounds don't close. They just stop bleeding. I went back to my hotel and sat by the window, watching the city lights flicker against the dark sky. I took out my journal, the one I'd carried through every storm, and began to write. They say forgiveness sets you free. But what they don't tell you is that sometimes walking away is forgiveness. Not for them, but for yourself. I begged for help and they ignored me. When I disappeared, they finally heard the echo of my silence. Karma doesn't rush. It arrives exactly when you've stopped waiting. As I closed the notebook, I felt a calmness settle deep within me. The kind that doesn't come from victory, but from closure. The kind that says, "You've done enough." The next morning, I left the city before dawn. The streets were empty, quiet, washed in pale blue light. I didn't look back this time. The past was no longer chasing me. It was fading behind me with every step. I returned to Brindle Bay that afternoon, the sea greeting me like an old friend. I walked straight to the pier, the one where I used to sit after my shifts and let the wind play with my hair. The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting a warm glow across the water. I pulled out the small seashell I'd kept, my reminder that even broken things could still be beautiful, and tossed it into the waves. It sank slowly, disappearing beneath the surface, taking the last remnants of my pain with it. A fisherman nearby smiled at me and said, "Making a wish?" I smiled back. "No, letting one go." That night, I fell asleep to the sound of waves crashing softly against the shore. My dreams were quiet, peaceful. I saw the girl I used to be, frightened, desperate, unseen, standing at the edge of a cliff, watching the sea. She turned, smiled at me, and then walked away, dissolving into light. When I woke the next morning, the world felt new. The ocean glimmered under the early sun, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I was waiting for something. Not for love, not for revenge, not even for forgiveness. I had found what I had been searching for all along, myself. From that day forward, I stopped counting the years since I left. I stopped measuring my life in losses. Instead, I began to count the quiet mornings, the soft laughter shared over coffee, the sunsets that painted the world gold. Because in the end, karma didn't speak through punishment, it spoke through peace. And peace, I realized, was the most beautiful sound silence could ever make.